The first call I made on what should have been my wedding day wasn't to my fiancé, it was to the bank. Freeze every corporate authorization tied to Mercer Medical Freight, I said. My voice calm enough to surprise even myself. No transfers, no changes in voting rights, no executive signatures until further notice. The woman on the other end hesitated. Ms. Whitmore, are you certain? Those restrictions will immediately halt today's board transactions. I'm counting on it. I ended the call before she could ask another question. Outside the bridal suite, I could hear the faint sound of a string quartet drifting across the estate. More than 200 guests had already taken their seats beneath the white canopy overlooking the horse pastures. Waiters carried champagne across perfectly trimmed lawns. Florists made last-minute adjustments to arrangements that had cost more than my first year's salary. Somewhere downstairs, Grant Mercer was probably greeting investors, family friends, local politicians, and business partners who believed they were about to witness the wedding of two successful families. They had no idea they were actually waiting for the collapse of one. I looked down at the small walnut music box resting on the vanity. Its brass latch was scratched. One corner carried a dark burn mark that had been there for almost 30 years. When I was 8 years old, our apartment caught fire because an old space heater shorted out in the middle of winter. My mother managed to pull me outside before the smoke swallowed the hallway. The only thing she went back for was this little music box. Years later, after spending months restoring it by hand, she smiled and told me something I never truly understood. People always think what survives a fire is lucky. She ran her fingers across the scarred wood. But sometimes the burn is there, so you'll never forget where the danger came from. I closed my eyes. Last night, I finally understood exactly what she meant. The music box wasn't supposed to be here. I had forgotten it at the Mercer estate after dinner. I drove back because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving the last thing my mother had ever repaired inside someone else's house. That decision saved my life, not because of the box itself, because of what I heard while I was searching for it. A conversation, 4 voices, one family, one plan, and my name appearing in every sentence as if I were nothing more than another business asset waiting to be transferred. I didn't cry. I didn't burst through the door. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I listened. Every promise Grant had whispered over 6 years, every embrace from his mother, every reassuring smile from his father, every toast to family. One by one, they collapsed under the weight of the truth. A knock interrupted my thoughts. Claire, the wedding coordinator spoke gently through the door. We're ready whenever you are. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The silk gown fit perfectly. The veil rested neatly over my shoulders. Anyone looking at me would have seen a bride moments away from the happiest day of her life. Only I knew I had already buried that future sometime before sunrise. I picked up the music box. Then I reached for my phone. Another notification appeared. Corporate banking, emergency authorization confirmed. All executive transactions suspended. Effective immediately. I smiled for the very first time that morning. Not because I was about to walk down the aisle, because somewhere inside the Mercer estate, men who believed they had already won were discovering that every door they planned to lock behind me had just slammed shut on them instead. And it had all begun the night before. When I turned my car around to retrieve one forgotten music box, people always ask when I should have realized something was wrong. Was it the first time Grant canceled our anniversary because his father suddenly needed him at the office? Was it the dozens of times his mother reminded me that marriage meant learning how to put my husband's family first? Or was it when I quietly became the person solving problems for everyone while nobody ever seemed interested in mine? The truth is, none of those moments felt dangerous by themselves. That is how manipulation usually works. It never arrives looking like a trap. It arrives looking like trust. 6 years earlier, I met Grant Mercer at a regional business conference outside Columbus, Ohio. I worked as a corporate turnaround consultant, helping struggling companies recover before they collapsed. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved it. Every broken business felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Grant was charming without trying too hard. He listened more than he talked. When everyone else was busy promoting themselves, he was asking questions about my work. You actually enjoy fixing disasters, he asked over coffee. I laughed. Someone has to. Most people run away from problems. I've never been very good at running, he smiled. I think that's exactly why I'd like to see you again. For the first time in years, dating felt easy. There were no games, no dramatic arguments, no impossible expectations. At least that's what I believed. 3 months later, I introduced him to my mother. My mom, Evelyn, had spent 35 years working as an accountant for manufacturing companies across Ohio. Numbers made sense to her. People were harder. She welcomed Grant politely. She thanked him for bringing flowers. She laughed at his jokes. But after he left that evening, she quietly washed the coffee cups before speaking. "He seems kind," she said. "I know." She dried the cup carefully with a towel. "Kind isn't the same thing as trustworthy." I rolled my eyes. "Mom, I'm not telling you to leave him." She looked at me with that calm expression only mothers seem to master. "I'm telling you to keep your eyes open." At the time, I thought grief was making her overly cautious. The cancer had already returned. She knew she didn't have much time left. I assumed she was simply afraid of leaving me alone. Grant became my anchor during those months. He drove my mother to doctor's appointments when I couldn't leave work. He picked up prescriptions. He sat beside us during chemotherapy sessions without ever complaining. The night my mother passed away, he stayed with me until sunrise. He didn't try to fill the silence. He simply sat there. When you've just lost the only parent you've ever known, silence can feel more comforting than words. That's why I loved him. Not because he rescued me, because he never tried to make my grief about himself. Or so I thought. After the funeral, the Mercer family seemed to embrace me completely. Grant's mother, Diane, called every Sunday. His father, Richard, insisted I spend holidays at their estate. His older sister, Mallory, joked that she had finally gained the sister she'd always wanted. For someone who suddenly found herself eating dinner alone most nights, it felt comforting. I wasn't replacing my family. I was building another one. Looking back now, I realize I confused being welcomed with being understood. About 2 years before our wedding, Mercer Medical Freight started experiencing financial problems. Nothing dramatic at first. Late vendor payments, cash flow issues, several contracts performing below expectations. Grant mentioned it over dinner one evening. "My dad hasn't been sleeping. Can I help?" He shook his head immediately. "I don't want business mixed with our relationship." But a week later, Richard called me himself. "I only need your opinion," he said. "Nothing more." I should have charged them consulting fees. Instead, I spent weekends reviewing contracts, supplier costs, warehouse operations, and transportation schedules. Within a month, I identified several costly mistakes the company had ignored for years. The recovery plan worked. The business stabilized. Employees kept their jobs. Richard shook my hand afterward. "I owe you one," I smiled. "We're family." He smiled back. "I hope so." At the time, those words sounded warm. Now I hear something entirely different. Over the following year, I noticed something subtle. Whenever the company celebrated progress, Grant's family praised him. Whenever new problems appeared, they quietly called me. I never questioned it. Helping people felt natural, especially people I believed loved me. Then, 8 months before the wedding, Grant proposed. It happened inside the restored horse barn on the Mercer estate. Hundreds of tiny lights hung from the ceiling. A violinist played softly in the corner. There were white hydrangeas everywhere, my mother's favorite flowers. I started crying before he even opened the ring box. "I know I can't replace what you lost," he whispered, "but I promise you'll never feel alone again." I believed every word. The next 8 months disappeared in a blur of cake tastings, invitation lists, dress fittings, vendor meetings, and endless family dinners. Life finally felt like it was moving forward again. The night before the wedding, the rehearsal dinner lasted much longer than expected. Everyone laughed. Richard gave a toast about legacy. Diane hugged me 3 separate times. Mallory teased me about becoming an official Mercer by lunchtime tomorrow. Grant walked me to my car. He kissed my forehead. "You should get some sleep." "I doubt I'll be able to." "Nervous?" "A little." He laughed softly. 24 more hours. "I know." I watched him disappear back toward the main house while I started the drive to my hotel. For the first 20 minutes, I couldn't stop smiling. Then, halfway down the highway, my stomach suddenly dropped. The walnut music box, my mother's music box. I had left it behind at the estate. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. Most people would have gone back because it was valuable. I went back because it wasn't. It was priceless. I slowed the car, crossed into the turning lane, and made a U-turn toward the Mercer estate. I had absolutely no idea that I was driving straight toward the truth that would save the rest of my life. By the time I pulled back onto the Mercer estate, most of the celebration had ended. The valet station was empty. Half the lights around the courtyard had already been switched off. Only the main house still glowed against the darkness, its windows spilling warm yellow light across the gravel driveway. From a distance, it looked peaceful, like the home of a family getting ready to celebrate a wedding. I parked near the greenhouse instead of the front entrance. Grant had given me the security code months earlier. "You don't have to ring the bell every time," he'd joked. "This place is yours now." The memory made my stomach tighten. I keyed in the code. The lock clicked open. Inside, the greenhouse was almost silent. Rows of citrus trees cast long shadows beneath the glass ceiling. The air smelled faintly of damp soil and fresh flowers left over from the rehearsal dinner. Near the center table, exactly where I'd remembered leaving it, sat my mother's walnut music box. I let out a quiet breath. "There you are." I reached toward it, then froze. Voices. At first, I couldn't tell where they were coming from. The greenhouse was empty. No footsteps, no movement, just voices. Then I looked up. Small speakers were mounted near the ceiling beams, the estate's sound system. Someone must have forgotten to disconnect the internal intercom after dinner. Richard's voice echoed softly through the speakers. "She still hasn't signed." Another voice answered immediately. "Grant. She will." I stood perfectly still. Richard sounded irritated. "We're running out of time." "I know. You've had 6 years." There was a pause. Grant sighed. "I said she'll sign." Something inside me shifted. Not fear, not yet. Just curiosity. Signed what? I hadn't signed anything except normal wedding paperwork. Richard spoke again. "After tomorrow, she won't keep questioning every document we put in front of her." Mallory laughed quietly. "She's practically family already." My fingers slowly curled around the handle of the music box. A strange feeling settled into my chest. The kind you get when you're watching a movie and suddenly realize you've misunderstood the entire plot. Grant spoke again. "Claire likes details." "Then distract her." That was Diane. "She'll be exhausted after the ceremony." Mallory chuckled. "A honeymoon is a wonderful time to sign paperwork." Someone poured a drink. Ice clinked against crystal. Richard lowered his voice. "The authorization has to be completed before the supplier audit." "I know." "Then stop worrying about whether she asks questions." Grant didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "I don't want to push too hard," Richard laughed. "You've been dating her for 6 years." Another pause. Then came the sentence that made my heartbeat stumble. "She trusts you more than anyone." Silence, followed by Grant's reply. "I know." Nothing about his tone sounded surprised. Nothing sounded offended. He didn't ask what Richard meant. He simply accepted it. My mouth suddenly felt dry. Maybe I was misunderstanding. Maybe they were talking about routine corporate documents. Maybe this had nothing to do with me. I wanted that explanation more than anything. Richard interrupted my thoughts. "Once the voting authority is transferred, everything else becomes simple." Mallory asked, "And Claire?" Richard answered without hesitation. "She'll never know the difference." The music box almost slipped from my hands. Voting authority? Transferred? To whom? I took one slow step backward. Every instinct told me to leave, to get into my car, to pretend I'd never heard any of this. Then another sentence stopped me. Mallory laughed. "I still can't believe she fixed this company for free," Richard answered calmly. "People protect what they believe belongs to them." Diane added, "She thinks she's investing in a marriage." Nobody laughed. Nobody corrected her. Grant didn't say a word. I felt something inside me begin to crack, not loudly, quietly, like thin ice spreading fractures beneath fresh snow. I looked toward the greenhouse doors. Leave, right now, before they came out. I turned. My phone vibrated. A security notification flashed across the screen. New login detected. My private cloud archive. Authorized device. Grant Mercer. Time, 3 minutes ago. I frowned. That archive contained my consulting files. financial records, draft contracts, personal notes. Grant knew the password because years ago I'd asked him to retrieve a document while I was traveling. He had never used it again. At least, I thought he hadn't. Another voice echoed overhead. Richard again. Did you access her files? Yes, Grant said. I copied the financial projections. My breathing stopped. Richard asked, did she notice? No. What about the debt agreement? It's still in her archive. Richard's answer came immediately. Good. Leave it there. If she thinks she still has control, she'll never realize when she loses it. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. This wasn't wedding paperwork. This wasn't family planning. This wasn't harmless business. They were talking about my documents, my contracts, my legal rights. And Grant. Grant had entered my private files without telling me, not by accident, on purpose. For the first time all night, I wasn't wondering whether I'd misunderstood. I was wondering how long it had been happening. I backed away another step. The gravel outside crunched. Someone had opened a nearby door. Footsteps, close, very close. Mallory's voice drifted through the speakers. I think somebody's outside. Every muscle in my body locked. The greenhouse suddenly felt much smaller than before. I slipped behind a row of tall lemon trees, just as the side door began to open. Light spilled across the stone floor. A man's silhouette appeared in the doorway, Grant. He looked around casually, phone still in his hand. For one terrifying second, I thought he had seen me. Instead, he frowned at the empty greenhouse. Must have been the wind. He walked to the center table. His eyes landed on the empty space where the music box had been. He stopped. Claire? No answer. He looked toward the parking area through the glass walls. My car was hidden behind the hedges. Grant stood there for several seconds. Then he slowly reached into his pocket. His phone lit up. I'll call her, he said. Mine began vibrating instantly inside my purse. His name filled the screen. Grant calling. I stared at it. One swipe, one hello, and my entire future would continue exactly as planned. Or I could stay silent. I pressed the side button. The call went straight to voicemail. Inside the greenhouse, Grant lowered his phone and frowned. That's strange. Richard's voice echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the hallway. Everything all right? Grant looked once more toward the dark parking lot. Then he answered with complete confidence. Yeah, everything's under control. I closed my eyes. For 6 years, I had believed those words meant he was protecting me. Standing there in the darkness, I finally understood. He had never been talking about me. He had been talking about the plan. I didn't drive home immediately. I pulled into a 24-hour gas station about 10 miles from the Mercer estate and parked beneath the brightest light I could find. For several minutes, I simply sat there with both hands gripping the steering wheel. My phone buzzed. Grant. I watched it ring until the screen went dark. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Grant, did you make it back to the hotel? I stared at the words. If I had received that text an hour earlier, it would have made me smile. Now it felt like reading a script from someone I no longer recognized. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my cloud account. Grant's device had accessed 3 folders. One contained financial projections. Another contained draft consulting reports. The third was labeled personal. I clicked through the activity log. Nothing had been deleted. Nothing had been edited. Files had only been viewed. Carefully, methodically. As if someone wasn't looking for memories. They were looking for leverage. A cold realization settled over me. Grant hadn't logged in that night because of a sudden emergency. He already knew exactly where everything was. He'd been inside my digital life before. I had simply never thought to check. My chest tightened. Not because of the documents, because trust leaves behind fingerprints you never think to dust for. I changed every password I owned. Email, cloud storage, bank accounts, investment portals, 2-factor authentication, recovery contacts. By the time I finished, it was nearly 2 a.m. Only then did I drive back to my apartment. The wedding dress still hung beside my bedroom window. Soft ivory silk, hand-finished lace, 8 months of planning, thousands of dollars, hundreds of excited conversations. It looked exactly the same. Only I had changed. I placed the walnut music box on my kitchen table. For a long time, I just stared at it. Finally, I opened it. The tiny brass mechanism no longer played perfectly. The melody skipped every few notes. My mother had warned me that one day it would stop altogether. "It's old," she'd said, "but sometimes broken things still tell the truth." Inside the lid rested a folded piece of paper. I had completely forgotten it was there. My mother's handwriting, only one sentence. "Never confuse love with access." I closed my eyes. How many times had she tried to teach me that lesson? How many times had I smiled and convinced myself she worried too much? Around 3:30 that morning, I called Naomi Reyes. She answered on the second ring. "Claire?" Her voice was immediately alert. "What's wrong?" "I need legal advice." "Right now? It's about Grant." Silence. Then, "I'm coming over." 40 minutes later, Naomi sat across from me with a cup of untouched coffee. I told her everything. The greenhouse, the conversation, the login alert, the documents. She never interrupted. When I finished, she leaned back slowly. "Do you have proof?" "I have the login records. They help, but they're not enough." "I know." "Did you record the conversation?" I shook my head. "No." Naomi looked disappointed for only a second. Then her expression hardened. "Claire, you have a much bigger problem." "I know." "No," she looked directly into my eyes. "I don't think you do. They don't need your house. They don't need your savings. They need your signature." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She reached into her briefcase and pulled out the amendment Grant wanted me to sign. "This document isn't about convenience." She circled one paragraph with her pen. "If this authorization becomes effective before the supplier audit, your voting rights temporarily transfer." I already knew that. "No, you knew what it was called. You didn't understand what it could become." She slid another document beside it. "The debt agreement you signed 18 months ago." I looked at it. "So?" Naomi folded her hands. "Claire, right now you are the largest secured private creditor connected to Mercer Medical Freight. If someone gains temporary authority over your voting rights, they don't just gain your vote, they gain your influence." My stomach dropped. "They could push transactions through before the audit." "Exactly. And if something illegal happens, my signature is attached." Naomi nodded once. "They won't need to steal your company. They'll simply let you take the fall." The room became painfully quiet. For the first time since leaving the estate, I wasn't thinking like a betrayed fiancé. I was thinking like a consultant. If Richard Mercer truly intended to move assets before the supplier audit, timing mattered more than emotion. Naomi seemed to read my thoughts. "What are you going to do?" I looked toward the wedding dress, then toward the music box, finally back at her. "I'm not getting married," she nodded. "I figured." "I'm also not telling them why." That made her smile. "Good, confused people make mistakes." I stood up. "So what's first?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Before anyone wakes up, call the bank, then call the lender, then call the compliance officer. After that," she glanced at the wedding dress, "you can cancel the wedding." Morning arrived faster than I expected. Sunlight spilled through my apartment windows. Today should have been photographs, hair appointments, champagne, a white limousine waiting outside. Instead, I pulled on a navy business suit. No makeup, no veil, no wedding shoes. Just the clothes I normally wore before difficult negotiations. My phone exploded with notifications. Diane. "Good morning, sweetheart. Today is the big day." Mallory. "Hair and makeup starts in an hour." Grant. "Can't wait to marry you." I read every message. Then locked my phone. No anger, no tears. Just extraordinary clarity. At exactly 7:15 a.m., I typed one sentence. Grant. "The wedding is canceled. Do not contact me again unless it is through legal counsel." I read it once. Removed 3 unnecessary words. Pressed. Send. Within seconds, the phone rang. Grant. I declined. It rang again, declined, again, again, again. Then Diane. Then Richard. Then Mallory. Then numbers I didn't recognize. Relatives, friends, wedding planners. I turned the phone face down. Naomi looked at me. "Ready?" I picked up my handbag. "The ceremony starts at 11. She smiled. "So does the investigation." Together, we walked out of the apartment. Behind us, the wedding dress remained hanging quietly beside the window, waiting for a bride who was never coming back. By the time Naomi and I reached her office, The wedding ceremony had already been scheduled to begin. At 11 o'clock sharp, I imagined guests taking their seats beneath the white canopy. The violin quartet would be playing. The florist would be making last-minute adjustments. Someone would probably be asking why the bride was running late. For 6 years, I had believed I was preparing for the happiest day of my life. Instead, I was sitting in a conference room reviewing corporate governance documents. Oddly enough, it felt like exactly where I belonged. Naomi placed 3 folders on the table. Before we think about what they're planning, she said, we need to think about how they'll respond. They'll deny everything. Of course. They'll say I misunderstood. They'll do more than that. She slid the first folder toward me. If Richard Mercer is half the businessman everyone believes he is, he already has a crisis plan. What kind of crisis plan? The kind that turns the whistleblower into the problem. Those words stayed with me. An hour later, they proved her right. My phone, which had been silent since I muted every Mercer family member, buzzed with a notification from social media. Someone had tagged me, then another and another. Within minutes, my screen filled with messages. I can't believe you left everyone at the altar. Grant deserved better, poor Mercer family. You humiliated them. I frowned. The story's already out. Naomi wasn't surprised. Read carefully. One local news website had already published a short article. Local business family's wedding canceled hours before ceremony. No names in the headline, but inside, every detail pointed toward me. According to unnamed family friends, the bride had become emotionally unstable following the death of her mother. Stress, cold feet, fear of commitment. The article even suggested Grant had done everything possible to support me through a difficult period. I looked up slowly. They're building a narrative. They're building evidence, Naomi corrected me. In court, public perception matters more than people like to admit. Another notification appeared. This one wasn't from social media. It came from my company's human resources department. Please contact us regarding a confidential matter. My stomach tightened. I called immediately. Melissa, our HR director, answered. Claire, her voice was unusually formal. Are you available to come in this afternoon? Is something wrong? There has been a complaint. What kind of complaint? I'm afraid I can't discuss details over the phone. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. That surprised me. A day earlier, I would have panicked. Now, everything seemed predictable. They've moved faster than I expected, Naomi said after I ended the call. They're trying to damage my reputation. They're trying to isolate you. We drove to my office together. Melissa greeted us privately instead of bringing me into the usual conference room. I'm sorry, she began. I know today's supposed to be. Someone contacted our executive team this morning. Who? They identified themselves as representatives of Mercer Medical Freight. Naomi quietly opened her notebook. Melissa continued. They claim you improperly influenced company decisions while maintaining an undisclosed financial interest in one of their vendors. I stared at her. What vendor? She handed me several printed emails. Mallory Keene Marketing. My eyes narrowed. I remembered those invoices. 2 years earlier, Mallory had asked me to review branding proposals during the company's restructuring. I had recommended against hiring her firm because another agency submitted a stronger proposal. The board eventually selected Mallory anyway. Someone had edited that part of the email chain. The printed version now made it appear as though I had personally introduced her company into the bidding process. Naomi looked over my shoulder. They edited the conversation, Melissa sighed. We don't know that yet. We only know what was submitted. I looked directly at her. Do you believe I did this? Melissa didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said, I've worked with you for 9 years. I've never seen you compromise your ethics. But the compliance committee has to investigate. I nodded. I understand. Walking back to Naomi's car, I finally allowed myself one deep breath. They're trying to bury me professionally. No, Naomi unlocked the passenger door. They're trying to make sure nobody believes you before you ever speak. Back at her office, we spread every document across the conference table. Contracts, board resolutions, bank agreements, email records. For hours, we built a timeline. One detail kept bothering me. Naomi? What? Why now? They could have tried this months ago. She looked at me for several seconds. Because before today, You still loved Grant. The room fell silent. She was right. If they had accused me a month earlier, I probably would have defended him, protected him, explained away every inconsistency. Love had been their greatest legal protection. Now they had lost it. Around 5 that afternoon, another email arrived. This one came directly from Mercer Medical Freight. Emergency board meeting. Mandatory attendance. Tomorrow morning. Agenda. Corporate restructuring. Executive voting authority. Supplier transition. I stared at the screen. They're still moving forward. They have to, Naomi replied. If the supplier audit starts before they move the contracts, their window closes. Something clicked inside my head. They're desperate, Naomi smiled. Exactly, and desperate executives make expensive mistakes. That evening, I returned to my apartment for the first time since sunrise. The wedding dress was still hanging where I'd left it. Only now sunlight had disappeared. The room felt strangely quiet, not lonely, just different. I walked to the kitchen table and picked up my mother's music box. Almost absent-mindedly, I turned it over. Something caught my eye, a tiny metal panel near the bottom. I'd never noticed it before. There was an almost invisible screw beside it. Curious, I found a small screwdriver in the junk drawer. The panel lifted away. Inside wasn't another music mechanism. It was a miniature digital voice recorder. My heart stopped. I remembered my mother during her final months. She often forgot where she'd left things. One day she'd laughed and said, "If my memory quits before I do, I'll let machines remember for me." With shaking hands, I connected the recorder to my laptop. One file appeared. Recorded. 10:42 p.m. last night. Length, 23 minutes. I frowned. 23? I had only overheard the conversation for a few minutes. What happened after I left? I clicked play. At first, there was silence, then footsteps. A chair scraped across the floor. Richard spoke first. "I think she was here," another voice answered. Grant. "No, her music box is gone." A long pause followed. Then Richard said quietly, "Good. If she heard anything, she still doesn't know enough." I felt every hair on my arms stand up. Naomi, who had arrived only minutes earlier, slowly pulled a chair beside me. "Keep listening," Grant's voice came back. "We should postpone everything," Richard answered immediately. "No, if we delay now, the auditors will start asking questions." Then came a sentence neither of us expected. Richard lowered his voice. "The money has already been moved?" Naomi and I looked at each other. Neither of us spoke. The recording continued. Mallory whispered, "What if Claire refuses to sign?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Then we'll let the investigators believe she approved the transfers before changing her mind." Grant finally spoke again. His voice sounded different this time, uneasy, almost frightened. "That wasn't our agreement." Richard's reply was ice cold. "You don't have a choice anymore." The recording ended. Naomi slowly closed the laptop. For the first time all day, she looked genuinely alarmed. "This isn't about manipulating a marriage anymore." She looked directly into my eyes. "They've already committed fraud." Outside, night settled over the city. Inside my apartment, the wedding was over, the lies were over, and the real war had finally begun. By 9 o'clock the next morning, every seat in Mercer Medical Freight's executive boardroom was occupied. The atmosphere felt nothing like a business meeting. It felt like a courtroom where everyone already believed they knew who the guilty party was. Richard Mercer stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, speaking quietly with 2 outside board members. He looked composed. Immaculate navy suit, silver tie, not a wrinkle, not a hint that his son's wedding had collapsed less than 24 hours earlier. Grant sat halfway down the conference table. His eyes found mine the second I walked in. He looked exhausted. He started to stand. "Claire?" I didn't stop. I took the empty chair across from him and placed my leather portfolio on the table. Naomi sat beside me without saying a word. Richard smiled politely. "I'm glad you decided to come." "I almost didn't," I answered. But then I remembered something. "Oh? I financed part of this company. I figured I deserved a front row seat." A few nervous laughs echoed around the room. Richard ignored them. "Let's begin." The corporate secretary started distributing folders. Agenda, quarterly financial update, supplier transition, temporary voting authorization. Exactly as Naomi predicted. Richard spoke confidently. As everyone knows, recent personal events have unfortunately created instability. His eyes drifted toward me. But Mercer Medical Freight remains financially sound. He clicked the remote. Charts appeared on the large screen. Revenue, forecasts, projected cash flow. Everything looked healthy, too healthy. Naomi leaned closer. Watch the dates. I did. Several reports had been generated after midnight. Impossible. The accounting period hadn't even closed. Richard continued. Our restructuring is nearly complete. The only remaining step is approval of several temporary authorizations. Grant never looked up from the table. He hadn't spoken once. Richard slid a document toward me. Claire, we'd appreciate your signature. I looked down. It was the same amendment. Only now 3 additional pages had been attached. Asset transfer authority, vendor approval delegation, emergency executive powers. None of those pages had existed when Grant first showed me the agreement. I closed the folder. No, Richard smiled patiently. I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly. You haven't even read. I've read enough. Silence settled over the room. Richard folded his hands. Then perhaps your attorney would like to explain why delaying this approval could jeopardize hundreds of jobs. Naomi answered before I could. Jobs are not protected by forged governance. Several board members exchanged confused looks. Richard's expression remained perfectly calm. Forged? That's a serious accusation. So is fraud. The room became noticeably quieter. Richard slowly turned toward me. Claire? I know emotions are running high after yesterday, but this is business. I met his eyes. Exactly, so let's discuss business. I opened my portfolio. Instead of removing a pen, I removed a portable speaker. Grant looked up immediately. His face drained of color. Richard's smile faded for the first time. What is that? My mother's music box remembered something. Without another word, I pressed play. Richard's voice filled the boardroom. The money has already been moved. Nobody moved. The recording continued. Mallory asking what would happen if I refused to sign. Richard explaining that investigators would believe I approved the transfers. Grant saying that wasn't our agreement. Richard replying, you don't have a choice anymore. The room felt frozen. When the recording ended, no one spoke. One board member quietly removed his glasses. Another slowly closed the financial report in front of him. Richard recovered first. This recording proves nothing. It proves context. It proves intent. It proves someone edited private conversations. Naomi calmly slid several documents across the table. Then perhaps these will help. Logan records, cloud access history, bank timestamps, digital authentication reports. Every document had been independently certified before the meeting. Richard picked up the first page. His confidence slipped ever so slightly. Still, he wasn't finished. He looked directly at the board. Even if mistakes were made, none of this changes the company's financial position. I finally spoke. No? I connected my laptop to the projector. A completely different balance sheet appeared. Not the polished version Richard had presented. The original one. Every hidden liability. Every undisclosed transfer. Every shell invoice. Every suspicious payment. The room erupted. What is this? Why wasn't this disclosed? These numbers don't match ours. Richard turned toward the CFO. The man looked terrified. I never saw those entries. Because they weren't in your reports. I clicked again. A web of companies appeared. 3 LLCs. Different names, different addresses, same ownership trail. Each one eventually led back to Mallory. Naomi stood. For the record, these entities received consulting fees totaling $8.7 million over the last 18 months. A board member whispered, "My God." Richard finally lost his composure. "This is confidential information." "No," I answered quietly. "It's stolen money." Grant suddenly stood. "Enough." Every eye turned toward him. For several long seconds, he couldn't speak. Then, he looked at his father. "I asked you not to do this." Richard didn't even blink. "You asked me to save the company." "Not like this." "You knew exactly how." Grant lowered his head. I thought we'd move the contracts. I didn't know you'd already transferred the money." Richard laughed bitterly. You wanted clean hands? You should have left before you asked me to fix your mistakes. Grant looked as though someone had punched him. Everything he'd spent years believing about his father collapsed in one sentence. He slowly turned toward me. I'm sorry. The words brass cold barely reached the other side of the table. I looked at him for a long moment. I know. His eyes widened slightly. Then I finished. But you're apologizing because the truth found you, not because you chose it. Grant closed his eyes. He didn't argue, he couldn't. One of the outside directors finally spoke. Mr. Mercer, as chairman, I'm requesting your immediate resignation pending a forensic investigation. Richard stared at him. You can't remove me, another director answered. We don't have to, he pointed toward me. Our largest secured creditor already can. Every face in the room turned in my direction. Months earlier, when I purchased part of the company's secured debt, I had gained emergency restructuring rights if financial fraud was discovered. Richard had forgotten, or perhaps he never believed I'd use them. I slowly stood. I'm not here to destroy Mercer Medical Freight. I looked around the room. 412 people work for this company. They didn't create this fraud. They shouldn't lose their jobs because of it. I slid one final document onto the table, emergency restructuring plan. Independent management, forensic audit, protection for employee pensions, continuation of hospital deliveries. Richard looked at me in disbelief. You could liquidate us. I could. And you'd become even richer. I shook my head. My mother spent her life teaching me the difference between value and price. I'm removing the people who stole from this company. I'm not destroying the company itself. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. Real justice rarely sounds dramatic. It sounds like signatures. Votes, resignations, and silence. 10 minutes later, the emergency resolution passed unanimously. Richard Mercer was removed as chairman. Mallory was suspended pending criminal investigation. Federal auditors were notified. Outside counsel assumed control of company records. Grant quietly placed his employee badge on the conference table. I'll cooperate. No one stopped him. As everyone slowly left the boardroom, Grant paused beside me. I really did love you. I gathered my papers without looking up. I believe you? He seemed surprised. You do? Yes. I finally met his eyes. But love without courage is just another way people justify betrayal. He nodded once, then walked away. That was the last time I ever saw Grant Mercer. People assume revenge feels victorious. It doesn't. Not the real kind. Real revenge is much quieter. It is waking up one morning and realizing the people who tried to control your life no longer occupy a single corner of your mind. 3 months after the emergency board meeting, Mercer Medical Freight looked completely different. An independent management team had taken over. The forensic audit confirmed millions of dollars had been hidden through shell companies and fraudulent consulting contracts. Richard Mercer eventually resigned from every corporate position he held. Federal investigators continued reviewing the financial records. Mallory accepted a plea agreement before formal charges went to trial. As for Grant, he voluntarily testified. Afterward, he disappeared from Columbus. I never asked where he went. It wasn't my story anymore. The company survived. That mattered. Hundreds of employees still had jobs. Hospitals still received medical supplies. And for the first time in years, Mercer Medical Freight was operating with complete financial transparency. That outcome meant far more to me than seeing anyone punished. Life settled into something wonderfully ordinary. I accepted the promotion to executive director. The workload nearly doubled. Some nights I stayed in the office until long after sunset. But exhaustion feels different when it belongs to work you believe in. Every decision I made belonged to me. Every success, every mistake, every lesson. One Saturday morning, Naomi showed up at my condo carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. She looked around my living room. The moving boxes were finally gone. Books lined the shelves. Plants filled the windows. Pictures of my mother had replaced wedding decorations I once planned to display. It finally feels like you're home, she said. I smiled. It finally feels like my life. She handed me one of the coffees. So, any regrets? I thought about the question longer than I expected. I regret ignoring my instincts, she nodded. But I don't regret leaving. Naomi smiled. Good. Because the hardest decisions are usually the ones that give us ourselves back. A month later, I drove to the cemetery where my mother was buried. The walnut music box rested on the passenger seat beside me. Its melody still skipped every few notes. I had thought about repairing it. Eventually, I decided not to. Some scars deserved to remain visible. They reminded you where healing began. I placed fresh white lilies beside her headstone. For several minutes, I simply stood there. I understand now, I whispered. When you warned me about protecting what mattered, you were never talking about money. A warm breeze drifted through the trees. For the first time since losing her, I no longer felt like I was talking to someone who had left me. I felt like I was talking to someone whose lessons had finally caught up with me. Before leaving, I placed the music box gently against the stone. Then I hesitated. I picked it back up. No, I laughed softly. I still need this. Not because it reminded me of pain, because it reminded me that truth sometimes arrives disguised as inconvenience, a forgotten object, a delayed trip, one unexpected decision. Months passed. One evening after work, I stopped at a neighborhood bookstore. While browsing the business section, an older gentleman reached for the same book I was holding. He smiled apologetically. You first, I laughed. I think there are 2 copies. We talked for less than 5 minutes. Books, travel, Chicago winters, nothing extraordinary. When I left the store, I realized something that surprised me. I hadn't spent the conversation wondering whether he liked me, whether I sounded interesting, or whether this might become something. I had simply enjoyed talking to another human being. That felt like progress, real progress. Not because I had found someone new, because I no longer needed someone else to complete a version of myself that was already whole. Back at my condo, I opened the journal that had carried me through the hardest months of my life. The first pages were filled with fear, questions, and doubt. The later pages sounded like they had been written by an entirely different woman. On the final blank page, I wrote one last entry. The greatest gift I received wasn't discovering who betrayed me. It was discovering that I was strong enough to walk away before betraying myself. I closed the journal. This time, there were no more chapters to add. Late that summer, I received a small package with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note, no signature, only one sentence. Thank you for saving the company instead of destroying it. My family still has health insurance because of your decision. Folded beside the note was an employee identification badge from Mercer Medical Freight. No explanation, none was needed. I placed the note inside my mother's music box. It seemed like the right place for it, because that little box no longer represented the night my wedding ended. It represented the day my life truly began. Sometimes people ask whether I believe everything happens for a reason. I honestly don't know. Some things are simply cruel. Some betrayals are completely unnecessary. Some people make choices that destroy lives because greed matters more to them than love. But I do believe something else. When the truth finally appears, we all face the same choice. We can protect the illusion, or we can protect ourselves. The night before my wedding, I turned my car around because I forgot a small wooden music box. For years, I thought that box was the last gift my mother ever gave me. I was wrong. Her final gift wasn't the music box. It was the value she spent an entire lifetime teaching me. Integrity, self-respect, the courage to walk away from anything that demands the price of your dignity. Those lessons saved me long before I realized I needed saving. I never became Claire Mercer. I remained Claire Bennett. And looking back now, I wouldn't change a single thing. Because sometimes the happiest ending isn't walking down the aisle. Sometimes it's having the courage to turn around before you ever get there.